The telegram hit the floor of the marshal's office like a stone dropping into still water, and Sadie Doyle stood in the doorway watching Ralph Conroy's face for any sign that he had heard every word she had said over the past 3 weeks, every desperate, careful, revealing word, and that he had simply chosen to say nothing. His jaw was set like iron. His eyes, gray as a winter sky over the Kansas plains, moved across the telegram without blinking, and then he folded it once, twice, tucked it inside his vest pocket, and looked directly at her, through her, past her, as though she were a window he had no interest in opening. "You should get back to the boarding house, Miss Doyle," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, the kind of control that costs a man something. She had come to tell him the truth. The whole truth, not the careful half-truths she had been offering him like breadcrumbs across a dangerous trail for 3 weeks. She had come to tell him that the man he was hunting, the man whose name was on every wanted poster nailed to every fence post between Hays City and Dodge, was her brother. But he already knew. She could see it in the way he didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't ask her what she was doing standing in his doorway at 9:15 in the evening with her hair loose around her shoulders and a confession written plain across her face. He already knew, and he had let her talk, and he had listened, and he had remembered, and he had said nothing. The betrayal of it cut through her like a cold blade. "You knew," she said. It was not a question. Ralph Conroy finally let his gray eyes settle on hers, and for one unbearable moment the mask slipped just enough that she could see what was underneath it, and what was underneath it was not indifference. What was underneath it was something far more dangerous than indifference. "Go home, Sadie," he said quietly, and that was the first time he had used her given name. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat at the very edge of the cattle trail country in the autumn of 1878, a place that existed at the knife-edge boundary between civilization and the wide, untamed land that stretched south into Indian Territory. It was a town of dust and ambition, of cattlemen and gamblers and honest homesteaders trying to make something out of the flat, wind-scoured earth. It was a town that needed a marshal, and 6 months before Sadie Doyle arrived on the southbound stage, the county had appointed Ralph Conroy to be that marshal. He had come from Wichita, where he had served as a deputy, and before that from a small town in Missouri where he had grown up with a farmer's back and a lawman's instincts, the kind of man who noticed things, who cataloged small details the way a scholar catalogs rare texts, quietly and without ceremony, but never forgetting a single one. Caldwell was growing. The cattle drives brought money and trouble in equal measure, and the town had been working hard to present itself as respectable, a place where families could settle and merchants could prosper, rather than just another trail-end boomtown that would be dust and memories in another decade. The new marshal was part of that project. Ralph Conroy had come to Caldwell to impose a quiet order on a place that had seen more than its share of blood. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with the weathered complexion of a man who spent long hours in the sun and wind, and he wore his authority the way some men wear a Sunday coat, like it fit him well but he hadn't forgotten what it was for. He was not known as a warm man. He was known as a fair one, which in Caldwell in 1878 was considerably more valuable. Sadie Doyle arrived in October, 3 weeks before the telegram, on a stage from Wichita that had run 2 hours behind on account of a thrown wheel outside of Wellington. She was 26, with dark auburn hair and a directness in her green eyes that made people either trust her immediately or distrust her for the same reason. She carried 2 valises, a canvas satchel, and enough secrets to fill a shipping trunk. She had come to Caldwell because her brother Daniel was somewhere in the surrounding country, and Daniel was in serious trouble. Daniel Doyle was 23, reckless in the way that young men sometimes become when they have grown up without enough guidance and with too many grievances, and in the summer of 1878 he had fallen in with a man named Cole Haddon, who ran a loosely organized outfit of thieves and rustlers operating out of the breaks south of the Arkansas River. Cole Haddon had a particular talent for making desperate young men feel that the world owed them what they were taking from it. And Daniel Doyle, who had grown up watching their father lose everything to bad land and bad weather, and what he called the railroad's casual cruelty, was exactly the kind of young man Cole Haddon could use. Sadie had gotten a letter from Daniel in September, a short, frightened letter that was not frightened of anything outside himself, which was the worst kind of frightened. He had written that he was mixed up in something he didn't know how to get out of. He had not said what it was. He had not needed to. Sadie had read the newspapers. She knew Cole Haddon's name. She had no plan beyond finding Daniel and getting him out before whatever was coming came. She had no connections in Caldwell, no contacts, no allies. She had rented a room at Mrs. Harriet Plum's boarding house on Front Street, found work as a seamstress taking in alterations from the town's small but aspirational population of women who wanted their dresses properly fitted, and she had begun, carefully, to listen. The listening was what brought her into contact with Ralph Conroy. The first time she saw him was the second morning after her arrival, when she crossed the main street to purchase thread from the dry goods store, and he passed her on the boardwalk with a nod that was both courteous and impersonal. She noticed his badge. She noticed the way he scanned the street automatically, not with anxiety but with professional habit, the way a sailor reads weather. She cataloged him as a potential problem and moved on. The second time was 4 days later at the post office, where she went to see if Daniel had replied to the letter she had sent to the last address she had for him, a camp outside Medicine Lodge. He had not. Ralph Conroy was behind her in line, collecting a packet from behind the counter, and he said nothing to her except, after the postmistress had told Sadie there was no mail, waiting for something important. It was a simple question. It might have meant nothing. "A recipe from my aunt," Sadie said, which was a lie delivered with the kind of easy warmth that made it sound like the most boring possible truth, and she turned and walked out. She found out later, from Mrs. Plum, who knew everything about everyone in Caldwell the way small-town landladies inevitably do, that Ralph Conroy collected his mail on Mondays and Thursdays, never other days unless there was official business, and that she had been standing behind him on a Wednesday afternoon. That was when she first understood that he was paying attention to her. She was not afraid of him precisely. She was wary of him, which was a more intelligent response to a man with a badge and the kind of focused gray eyes that didn't miss much. She decided to do what she always did when she was wary of something. She moved toward it rather than away from it, because things you move toward stay in your field of vision, and things you run from have a habit of catching up. So she began, with great care and perfect casualness, to talk to Ralph Conroy. It started in small ways. She passed the marshal's office on her way to deliver alterations to the wife of the town's largest merchant, and she paused because the door was open, and she said something about the weather, because everyone in Kansas talked about the weather with the seriousness of a military campaign, and he looked up from his desk and replied briefly, and she moved on. She did this again 2 days later. And then again. She told herself, gathering information. She needed to know what he knew about Cole Haddon's outfit. She needed to understand the shape of whatever net the law was drawing around the area south of the river, so she could find Daniel before that net closed. What she had not planned for was Ralph Conroy's habit of listening. Most men, Sadie had found, did not truly listen to women. They heard the surface of what women said and translated it according to what they expected women to mean. Ralph Conroy listened to everything. He listened with his whole face still and his eyes steady, and a quality of attention that was more unsettling than being ignored, because it meant that every careless word she dropped, every inadvertent detail she offered while she was busy calculating what she could extract from the conversation, was being filed away somewhere in that careful, precise mind. She didn't realize the extent of it until the 3rd week. By then, she had, in the course of 6 separate brief conversations, mentioned without ever quite saying outright that she had a family member who had made some poor choices. She had mentioned, in the context of discussing the general moral question of whether desperate men were wholly responsible for their crimes, that she believed circumstances could shape a person away from their better instincts without entirely erasing those instincts. She had mentioned, when the conversation had turned to Cole Haddon in a natural and inevitable way, because Haddon was the primary news in Caldwell that autumn, that she thought his followers were more victims than criminals in a meaningful sense, and that she hoped any lawman pursuing them would have the discernment to separate the dangerous men from the merely lost ones. Each time she had said these things, Ralph Conroy had nodded or offered a measured response or simply listened, and then he had changed the subject or she had moved on, and she had told herself she was being careful. She had not been careful enough. The afternoon before the night of the telegram, Sadie had been in the dry goods store when she overheard two men talking near the hardware supplies. They were speaking in low voices, but she had good ears and the store was not large, and what she heard stopped her breath entirely. Cole Haddon's outfit had been tracked to a line camp 12 miles south of the river. The county sheriff's office in Wellington had telegraphed Marshal Conroy. There was going to be a coordinated action within the next 48 hours. Multiple deputies from 2 counties, a small detachment from the state militia already positioned in Caldwell without any public announcement, and the specific object of bringing in Cole Haddon dead or alive. No one had said anything about distinguishing between the dangerous men and the merely lost ones. Sadie had set down the spool of thread she was holding, paid for what was in her basket, and walked out into the October afternoon with her heart running cold and fast in her chest. Because if Daniel was at that camp, and she was almost certain he would be taken in that action. And in 1878 in Kansas, the distance between being taken in a deputy's action and being buried in a pauper's grave was not always as great as it should have been. She had gone to Ralph Conroy's office to tell him the truth, or as much of the truth as she could bear to offer, which was that her brother was likely in that camp, that he was not a hardened criminal but a frightened young man who had made terrible mistakes, and that she was asking him, woman to man, with whatever credit she had built up in their strange, careful, 3-week-long series of conversations, to see that Daniel was given the chance to surrender rather than being shot in the general confusion of a raid on a wanted outlaw's camp. What she had found, instead, was the telegram already in his hand, and the certainty, reading his face, that he had already known exactly who she was and why she was in Caldwell. She stood in the doorway of the marshal's office after he said her name, after that single devastating use of Sadie, that told her the entire game had been visible to him from the beginning, and she understood that she was standing in a trap she had walked into with her eyes open because she had been too sure of herself. "How long have you known?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on his desk threw a warm, narrow light across the room. Outside, Caldwell's Front Street was doing its usual evening business, the sound of piano music from the Long Branch Saloon 2 blocks down, the horses at the rail hitching and shifting, the distant bark of a dog. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. None of it touching the extraordinary silence inside that small office. "Long enough," Ralph said. "That is not an answer." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and there was something in them she couldn't quite name, something that was not just professional calculation but something older and more personal than that. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He stood up from behind his desk. He was tall, taller than she usually remembered between their conversations, the kind of tallness that becomes apparent when a man is in motion. He came around the desk and stopped a few feet from her, and she held her ground because she was Sadie Doyle, and she had not come all this way to back up. "I knew before you arrived," he said. "The sheriff in Wichita sent word when he saw your name on the stage manifest. Daniel Doyle's sister. He thought I should know." The breadth of what he was telling her took a moment to settle. Before she arrived, he had known before she ever walked down Front Street, before she ever bought thread or collected her mail or stood in his doorway talking about the weather. Every conversation had been something else on his side of it, something she had thought was a slowly built connection being a careful observation of a person he had already identified as connected to his investigation. "Then why," she said carefully, "did you let me talk to you?" Something crossed his face that she could not quite categorize, "Because I wanted to hear what you would say." It was such a simple answer and such a complicated one at the same time. She stared at him. "You were trying to get information from me," she said, "about the investigation." "Yes," he said, "at first." The "at first" landed in the room between them like something irretrievable. "And later?" she asked. Ralph Conroy looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away, which was, she was beginning to understand, what he did when something was true that he wasn't prepared to say out loud. "Your brother," he said. "Tell me about him." She wanted to demand he answer her question. She wanted to turn around and walk out and let him conduct his raid and face what came of it, rather than stand here letting him redirect every dangerous subject into safe territory. But Daniel's life was in the balance, and she was not someone who chose pride over purpose, so she told him. She told him about growing up in Missouri. She and Daniel, with their father Joseph, who had been a good man, eroded by hard luck into a bitter one, who had lost the family farm in 1869 to a combination of drought and a bank that had no patience for either. She told him about the years afterward when they had moved between relatives' houses. She and Daniel and their mother before their mother died of fever in 1872, and about Daniel being 14 when their mother died, and how 14 was too young to lose your mother when you'd already lost everything else, and how she had watched something in her brother harden in a way she couldn't reach. She told him that she had worked as a seamstress, as a hired companion, as a schoolteacher's assistant in 3 different towns, doing whatever honest work she could find, and that she had sent money to Daniel when she could and letters always, trying to stay connected, trying to remain the one fixed point in his life that pointed towards something decent. She told him that she had read Cole Haddon's name in the newspapers and felt sick in her stomach because she knew, the way you know things about the people you have grown up alongside, that this was exactly the shape of trap Daniel would fall into. And while she talked, Ralph Conroy stood still and listened with that total quality of attention that she had spent 3 weeks finding deeply unnerving and that she now found in this rower context almost unbearably kind. When she stopped, the room was very quiet. "Daniel is 23, she said. "He has no record before this. He has never hurt anyone. I am asking you, Ralph, to remember that when you ride out tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment that stretched. "Then, how did you know about tomorrow?" "I have good ears and a habit of being in dry goods stores." Something moved in his face that might, in a different light, have been the beginning of a smile. "That's a liability in a marshal's territory. Or an asset," she said, "depending on which side of it you're standing on." The almost smile faded back into seriousness. He turned away from her and moved to the window that looked out on Front Street, and she watched his profile in the lamplight, the strong line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the slight tension across his back that told her he was working through something difficult. "I can't make the kind of promises you're asking for," he said finally. "I can't walk into an action against a dangerous outfit and guarantee any individual outcome. That's not how it works, and you know it." "I know it," she said. "I'm not asking for a guarantee. I'm asking you to know when you ride out there that Daniel Doyle is not Cole Haddon. I'm asking you to carry that knowledge with you." He turned back to look at her, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen from him before, something that was neither the professional neutral mask nor the careful seriousness of a lawman managing a complicated situation. It was something more personal and more exposed than either. "I'll know it," he said. "I already know it." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Go back to the boarding house," he said quietly. "Stay there tomorrow. Don't come to the office, don't go out on the street asking questions. Let me do my work. And if he's hurt, if there's anything to tell, I'll tell you." She stood there a moment longer, looking at him, wanting to say something more and not finding the right form for it. Then she picked up her shawl from where it had slipped off her shoulder and turned to leave. "Sadie," he said, stopping her at the door. She turned back. "Everything you told me about your brother," he said. "I'll remember it." She walked back to the boarding house in the cool October dark, with the feeling that she had given a man she did not fully trust the most important thing she had, and that she was not entirely sorry she had done it. The raid happened the following morning before dawn, when the sky over the Kansas prairie was still a deep, uniform dark, and the stars were beginning to thin toward the west. Sadie lay awake in her room at Mrs. Plum's, listening to the sounds of organized departure that began just after 3 in the morning, the low voices of men, the muffled movement of horses, the purposeful silence of people trying to be quiet in a way that is louder than normal sound. She did not go to the window. She had said she would stay put, and she intended to stay put, not because Ralph Conroy had told her to, but because she understood that appearing on the street at 3 in the morning would not help Daniel and might actively complicate whatever careful calibration Ralph had built into his approach. She stayed in bed and she prayed, which was not something she did with great regularity, but which she did thoroughly and without embarrassment in times of serious need. She prayed for Daniel's life, and for his surrender, and for the small, particular mercy of Ralph Conroy being nearby when whatever happened happened. She was still awake when the light changed outside her window and the morning birds began, and she was still awake when the sounds of returning riders came down Front Street sometime around 9 in the morning, the sound of horses and men, and the specific, heavy quality of a group of people returning from a difficult task. She made herself wait another hour before she went out. The news was spreading through town the way news always spread in a small place, from person to person with the organic efficiency of something everyone needs. Cole Haddon's camp had been raided. Cole Haddon himself had been taken alive, wounded in the shoulder. 3 of his men had been killed in the exchange of fire. 4 more had been taken prisoner. Daniel Doyle's name was not in any of the accounts she heard, not among the dead, not among the prisoners. She was standing on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, her mind working through what this could mean, running through the possibilities, the worst ones and the less terrible ones, when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her and turned to find Ralph Conroy 6 feet away, looking tired in the particular way of a man who has been awake for 30 hours and done hard physical work for most of them, but otherwise unmarked. "You're in one piece," she said. "Generally," he said. "Daniel wasn't there," she said. It came out flat because she didn't know whether flat was the right register or not. "No," Ralph said. "Do you know where he is?" "I have some ideas." She waited. He glanced up and down the street with that automatic lawman survey, then said, "Come to the office," in a low voice, and she followed him without hesitation. Inside, with the door closed, he told her what had happened. The camp had held 7 men. Cole Haddon and 3 who were committed members of his outfit, men with records who had clearly made their choices. 3 others who were, in Ralph's measured assessment, men who had been drawn into the situation through desperation or manipulation rather than genuine criminal intent. Those 3 were being held separately from Haddon and his core men, and Ralph had already sent a message to the county prosecutor in Wellington suggesting that their situations warranted individual consideration. Daniel had not been at the camp. But one of the prisoners, questioned separately by Ralph himself, had told him that Daniel Doyle had left the camp 5 days earlier. The prisoner had said, with some apparent discomfort, that Daniel had left after an argument with Cole Haddon over something Haddon had planned that Daniel wouldn't participate in. He had ridden south toward Indian Territory. Sadie absorbed this. Daniel had left. Daniel had, faced with a specific choice between going along with something and refusing it, refused it, which meant there was still the thing she had been protecting for years intact in him somewhere, the core of what their mother had tried to build in both of them. "He'll come back," she said. "If he's in the territory without money, he'll eventually come back toward a town." "Very likely," Ralph agreed. "You'll arrest him when he does." He was part of an active criminal outfit, Sadie. I'll have to bring him in. I know, she said. She took a careful breath. But you'll make sure he's evaluated fairly, given what the prisoner told you about why he left. Ralph looked at her steadily. If what the prisoner said holds up, which it likely will given his incentive to be accurate, then what Daniel Doyle did when he left that camp is the most important thing about his case. It matters to a prosecutor. It matters to a judge. I'll make sure the full account is part of the record. She looked at this man sitting across the desk from her, tired and direct and deeply competent, and felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the complicated truth that had been building for 3 weeks. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. The question was more direct than she usually allowed herself to be, but they had crossed some line the night before, standing in this office with her telling him the most important things about her family, and she did not know how to return to the careful distance they had maintained before. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you asked me to remember something important and I did, and it turned out to matter." It was not a complete answer. They both knew it, but she let it stand because she could see in his face that he was not ready to give the complete answer yet, and she was patient with things worth being patient for. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel remained unfound. Sadie remained in Caldwell because there was nowhere else to go, and because the work she had picked up in the town was paying her adequately, and because she was not willing to leave when Daniel might appear at any time from the south, riding back toward the only sister he had left in the world. During those 2 weeks, her relationship with Ralph Conroy changed in a way that neither of them quite named. He stopped treating her with the careful professional distance he applied to most civilians. He began stopping at the boarding house in the evenings, ostensibly to bring her information about the ongoing search for Daniel, which he could have delivered in far fewer visits than he made, and which he seemed to treat as an opportunity for conversations that extended well beyond their supposed subject. They talked about their respective childhoods in Missouri, which turned out to be similar in certain economic and emotional respects, both of them products of families that had tried hard and lost much and tried again. They talked about books, which surprised her, because she had not expected a frontier marshal to have read extensively, and he surprised her by having opinions about Dickens that were actually interesting. They talked about the nature of the law and whether it was a scaffold for justice or a substitute for it, and this conversation was pointed and animated, and went on for the better part of an evening while Mrs. Plum's parlor fire burned down and the other boarders retired one by one, until Sadie and Ralph were the only 2 left in the room and neither of them had noticed. He always left at a proper hour and with a proper formality, collecting his hat from the hook by the door and bidding her a correct good night. But the space between his leaving and the door closing had been growing incrementally longer as the weeks passed, as though the departure itself was becoming something he was reluctant to complete. Sadie was aware, with a part of herself that was both delighted and exasperated, that she had fallen significantly in love with Ralph Conroy somewhere in the middle of arguing about whether Oliver Twist contained an adequate critique of the English poor laws, which was about the most inconvenient timing for such a development she could have imagined. She was also aware that he had feelings for her that he was managing the way he managed everything difficult, with control and precision, and an apparent determination to feel them very thoroughly while doing nothing whatsoever about them. This would, she told herself, eventually require a direct intervention. The intervention was preempted by Daniel. He rode into Caldwell on a gray November morning with a coat that was too thin for the weather and 3 days of beard, and the specific expression of a man who has reached the end of a long road and is not entirely sure he deserves to arrive. He came to the marshal's office because Sadie had sent a letter to the trading post at Pond Creek, where she thought he might eventually pass, telling him to come directly to Ralph Conroy if he returned to Kansas, because she had reason to believe the marshal was a fair man. Ralph was sitting at his desk when Daniel walked in. Sadie was not there, because she had not known he was coming, but Daniel had spoken her name within the first 2 minutes of sitting down, and Ralph had sent one of his 2 deputies to fetch her from Mrs. Plum's. She came through the door of the marshal's office out of breath from hurrying, and Daniel stood up from the chair where he'd been sitting, and she crossed the room and held her brother's thin, cold face between her hands and looked at him, and something in her chest that had been contracted since September finally opened. "You idiot," she said softly. "I know," said Daniel. "I know." She held him for a long moment while Ralph Conroy stood by the window and looked at the street with a quality of deliberate inattention that she understood was him giving them privacy, and she was grateful for it. Daniel surrendered formally. Ralph processed it correctly fully, with every piece of documentation and notation that Daniel's case needed, including a detailed account of the prisoner's testimony about why Daniel had left the camp and what he had refused to participate in, which turned out to be a planned robbery of a settler family south of the river, a crime that Cole had wanted to commit because the settler was believed to be carrying proceeds from a recently sold cattle herd, and which Daniel, faced with the specific, concrete reality of a family in a homestead rather than an abstract notion of property, had walked away from rather than comply. The county prosecutor in Wellington reviewed Daniel's case. The prisoner testimony was corroborated by 2 others from Haddon's outfit who had also left before the settler family incident, though none of them had ridden away as definitively as Daniel had. The prosecutor, who was a practical man with a reasonably clear sense of what his limited resources were best applied to, agreed to a reduced charge and a sentence that would allow Daniel to be out in less than a year, with conditions of good behavior. It was not a clean outcome. It was not an outcome that erased what Daniel had done or the months he had spent riding with dangerous men. But it was an outcome that did not end his life or consume his future entirely, and it was substantially better than what Sadie had feared when she'd stepped off the stage in October. The afternoon that the prosecutor's decision was communicated, Sadie walked to the marshal's office and she did not knock. She pushed the door open and walked in, and Ralph was behind his desk, as he almost always was in the late afternoon, and he looked up with that look that had stopped being an impersonal lawman's assessment some weeks ago. "Thank you," she said. "I documented it accurately," he said. "The credit belongs to the accuracy of the record." "Ralph," she said. He stopped. "I know you documented it accurately because you are a man who documents things accurately. That is not a small thing, and I am not taking it for granted. I am thanking you for it." He held her gaze. "You're welcome," he said quietly. She did not leave. She stood in the middle of his office and she thought about everything she had held at arm's length for the past month and a half, the careful navigation and the strategic conversations and the slow, incremental revelation of being genuinely known by someone, and she decided that she had been careful long enough. "You remembered everything I said," she said. He didn't move. "From the very first conversation," she continued. "Everything I mentioned, everything I let slip, everything I said carefully and everything I said carelessly. You remembered all of it and you said nothing, and I spent 3 weeks thinking I was being clever, and the whole time you were just listening to me." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you say so? Why didn't you tell me you already knew who I was?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I wanted to hear what you would actually say when you trusted someone enough to say it. And you were working toward telling me the truth. Slowly and in pieces, but you were moving toward it. I didn't want to stop that by showing my hand too early." "Because of the investigation," she said. "That was the reason at first," he said, "the same as I told you before." "And what was the reason later?" He stood up. He came around the desk, the same way he had that night 3 weeks ago, and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him with her heart conducting itself in a way she hoped was not visible. "Because I wanted to know you," he said. "The version of you that was working up to honesty, not the version that was performing calm. I wanted to know the woman who drove 300 miles because her brother was in trouble, and who lied about recipes to a marshal, and who argued with strangers about Dickens, and who asked a lawman to remember something important and actually made it matter. The room was very quiet. Outside, November had arrived, and the wind coming off the prairie was cold and clear and smelling of dry grass. "You should have told me sooner," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Yes," he agreed. "I should have. It was a rather cruel position to put me in," she said, "thinking I had to manage you when you were already 10 steps ahead." "It was," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a man who apologized easily, she had come to understand. It was not that he was arrogant, but that he moved carefully enough that he rarely had cause to. The apology was genuine and therefore significant. "All right," she said. Something shifted in his expression, a small unlocking, a careful easing of some long-held tension. He raised his hand and, with a deliberateness that made it clearly a choice rather than an impulse, brushed back the strand of hair that had come loose from her pins during her quick walk from the boarding house. She stayed very still. "You're planning to leave," he said. It was not quite a question. "I had planned to," she agreed, "when Daniel's situation was resolved. And now I am revising the plan." She watched him process this, watched the careful gray eyes move over her face, watched the particular quality of attention he gave to everything he considered important. "There's not much to recommend Caldwell in November," he said. "The weather is unreasonable and the social life is limited." "I have found some things to recommend it," she said. He reached out and took her hand in his, carefully, like something he intended to treat with great care, and she felt the warmth of his grip go through her like sunlight. "Stay," he said quietly. It was not an elaborate declaration. It was not a grand, theatrical moment. It was a man who had listened to her for 6 weeks asking her, in one word, to continue to be somewhere he could keep listening. It was, she thought, exactly the right thing to say. "I'll stay," she said. November in Caldwell turned into December, and December brought hard frosts that silvered the flat Kansas earth and sent the cattle trade into its winter quiet, and gathered the townspeople into the warmth of their homes and businesses in a way that, paradoxically, made a community more visible by drawing it closer together. Ralph Conroy's courtship of Sadie Doyle was conducted with the same precise attentiveness he applied to everything, which meant it was both more thorough and more unhurried than most courtships, and Sadie found, to her own bemusement, that she did not mind this at all. He called on her at the boarding house in the evenings, properly and with Mrs. Plum's full awareness, which, given Mrs. Plum's position as the primary intelligence hub of Caldwell's social life, meant that the courtship was public knowledge within about 48 hours of its beginning. He brought her things he thought she would find interesting rather than things he thought she was supposed to want. A newspaper from Wichita with an article about a court case that bore on their ongoing argument about the law's relationship to justice. A piece of good dark chocolate from the mercantile that he had noticed her looking at once without purchasing. A book of essays by a woman writer whose work he had read and thought she would argue with productively. He was right on all counts. She did argue with the essays, thoroughly and with great enjoyment, while he listened and occasionally offered a counterpoint that she either demolished or was forced to concede the merit of, and the evenings spent in those conversations became the part of her days she looked forward to most. She learned things about him that the professional surface of the marshal's office had not revealed. She learned that he cooked, because a decade of living alone had made it practical, and that he was good at it in the direct, unfussy way he was good at most things. She learned that he had a dry wit that surfaced when he was comfortable, and that when he was comfortable, he was considerably less controlled than his working face suggested, more likely to laugh, more likely to say something unexpected, more capable of being surprised into an expression that was purely personal. She learned that he had been in a serious relationship years before, in Wichita, with a woman named Eliza who had eventually decided she could not make a life in law towns, who needed the stability and civilization of a city, and had moved east to family in St. Louis. He told Sadie this without bitterness and without false sentiment, just as a fact of his history that she had a right to know. "Did you love her?" Sadie asked. "I thought I did," Ralph said. "Looking back, I think I loved the idea of having someone who understood what I was trying to do. The actual Eliza and I understood each other less well than I had thought." "And what is it that you're trying to do?" Sadie asked. "Here, in Caldwell, what is the shape of it when you think about it honestly?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. The parlor fire was burning low. Mrs. Plum had retired. The house was quiet around them. "I'm trying to make a place," he said finally, "where people can live without the kind of fear that makes them into worse versions of themselves, where the law is something that actually protects the people who need protecting rather than just the people who already have everything. I know that sounds larger than one marshal in one Kansas town can accomplish." "It sounds like what you actually believe," she said, "which is more important than whether it sounds large." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had started to feel over these weeks, less like something she needed to navigate around, and more like something she was grateful to be fully seen by. "You do that," he said. "Do what?" "Say the thing that's at the center of what I was working toward saying, as though you've been following the same thought." "I've had a lot of practice listening," she said. He smiled, fully and without reservation, and it transformed his face in a way that she was beginning to feel was something she needed to see regularly in order to feel that the world was correctly ordered. Christmas came to Caldwell with snow, which was not unusual in Kansas December but which felt, this particular year, like a kind of punctuation. The town decorated itself with what it had available, which was not much but was applied with genuine enthusiasm, and there was a church social on Christmas Eve that drew most of the town into the small, warm building on 2nd Street. Ralph escorted Sadie, which was the first fully public acknowledgement of their courtship in a formal social setting, and she was aware of the town watching this with the benign, invested attention of a community that had been speculating about the Marshal's romantic situation for some time, and was glad to see it resolving in a satisfactory direction. After the social, walking back through the snow-quiet streets with his arm under her hand and the cold air clean and sharp around them, he stopped in the middle of the street, which was empty at this hour, and turned to her. "I need to tell you something," he said. She turned to face him. His breath was visible in the cold air. The snow had put a silence over the town that made his voice sound very clear. "I've been careful," he said. "Careful with this, with you. Possibly too careful because I've been afraid of making a mistake." "You haven't," she said. "Sadie," his voice was deliberate. "I am asking you something significant here. I need you to let me finish." She closed her mouth and waited. "I have been keeping a particular feeling at a careful distance for the past 2 months, he said, "because I wanted to be sure I was being fair to you, that I was asking you to stay for the right reasons, not because I wanted something for myself, but because I genuinely believe that you and I are suited to each other in a way that doesn't happen often and shouldn't be wasted by being too careful." He reached into his coat pocket. She watched him with her heart going very fast. He produced a ring, small and plain and gold, which he held between his fingers in the cold air with perfect steadiness. "I am not a romantic speaker," he said. "I can tell you accurately that I think about you before I think about anything else in the morning, and that every conversation I have is less interesting than the ones I have with you, and that when you're in a room I notice you the way I notice important things, automatically and completely. I can tell you that I know how you take your coffee and which arguments you'll win and which ones you're wrong about but will take 2 hours to concede, and I can tell you that knowing all of that has made me considerably happier than I was before I knew it." She was, for the first time in recent memory, entirely at a loss for words. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, "if you're willing." The snow fell softly around them in the empty Christmas street. The houses on either side glowed with lamplight. Caldwell was quiet and warm and entirely itself, imperfect and ambitious and genuine, the way things are when they are real." "Yes," said Sadie Doyle. "I am absolutely willing." He put the ring on her finger with both of them smiling in a way neither of them bothered to contain. And then he kissed her for the first time, briefly and warmly. And she decided immediately that brevity was not going to be a long-term policy, and kissed him back in a manner that said so clearly. They were married in the first week of February, 1879, on a Thursday morning when the sky was a brilliant, frozen blue, and the plains around Caldwell glittered with ice crystals that caught the light and threw it in every direction. Mrs. Plum wept during the ceremony, which she had been predicting as inevitable since approximately the second week of November, and the two deputies stood up for Ralph, and a young woman named Clara Adkins, who had been Sadie's closest friend in Caldwell since early December, stood up for her, and the Reverend Aldrich performed the ceremony with a conciseness that Ralph appreciated and a warmth that Sadie did. Ralph had arranged for them to take a house that had been standing empty on the east edge of town, a small place but a solid one, 2 rooms downstairs and 2 up, with a kitchen that had a decent stove and a porch that faced west, toward the long, unbroken line of the horizon, which was either beautiful or desolate depending on your relationship with open space. And Sadie had settled her relationship with open space very firmly on the side of beautiful. She moved her 2 valises and her canvas satchel from Mrs. Plum's boarding house to the house on the east edge of town, and the act of unpacking these things into the drawers and cupboards of a home that was actually hers felt more significant than she could have anticipated. She had been moving between other people's spaces for so long that having her own space felt like a kind of arrival that had nothing to do with geography. Daniel was still in the county jail in Wellington, but his sentence was a short one, and his conduct had been exemplary, and Sadie had received 2 letters from him that suggested the time had given him the space to think in a way he hadn't been doing before. She wrote to him every week, long letters full of the small details of her life in Caldwell, and Ralph added brief, formal notes at the bottom of these letters, short sentences that said, in the economical language of a man who chose his words carefully, that Daniel had a place to come when he was out, and that the offer was genuine. Spring came to the Kansas plains slowly, and then all at once, the way it does in that part of the country, a gradual warming that breaks one morning into the sudden absolute green of new grass running from horizon to horizon. Sadie stood on the porch of the house on the east edge of town on such a morning, watching the light run across the prairie, and heard Ralph come up behind her and felt his hands on her shoulders and leaned back against him. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I'm expecting." The silence behind her had a quality she would remember for the rest of her life, a deep, still fullness, as though the whole landscape had taken a breath with him. He turned her around, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before, something past the controlled openness she had learned to read, something that was entirely unguarded and entirely joyful. "When?" he said. "October," she said. "November, possibly, I'm not entirely certain." He pulled her against him and held on with a certainty and warmth that made her feel, definitively and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I was not expecting to have a family," he said into her hair. "Not at 32, not in a Kansas town. I had accepted certain things about my life." "You should never accept certain things," she said. "It limits the possibilities." He laughed, and she felt it against her, and it was one of the best feelings she had encountered in her life, which had contained some very good feelings and some very difficult ones in roughly equal measure. The summer of 1879 passed with the particular richness of a life that has arrived somewhere it intended to go. Caldwell was growing. There were 3 new businesses on Front Street and a second school being planned, and Ralph's work was the steady, engaged work of a man who had found the right place for his particular set of skills and convictions. Sadie's seamstress work had expanded into something closer to a proper dressmaking business, with a small front room in the house on the east edge of town, converted into a workspace where women came for fittings, and where she employed, by July, a young woman named June who had recently come from Iowa with skills and ambition, and no particular attachment to the idea that her options were limited. Daniel was released from the county jail in August, 3 weeks early on account of exemplary behavior, which neither Ralph nor Sadie found surprising given what they knew about Daniel's fundamental character when it was not being mismanaged by bad circumstances. He arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday afternoon in a wagon that belonged to a farmer outside Wellington who had given him a ride for the last 20 miles. And he was thinner than he had been in September, but his eyes were clear, and he carried himself with a directness that he had not had before, the directness of a man who had been given time to look at himself honestly and had decided to meet the result without flinching. Sadie fed him and Ralph sat across the table from him, and they talked for 3 hours that first evening, honestly and without ceremony, about what had happened and what came next. Ralph made it plain that Daniel was welcome in Caldwell, and that there were people who needed good work done, who would not hold his record against him if his conduct was solid, and Daniel made it plain that he understood the terms and was prepared to meet them. He found work at the livery stable, which suited him because he had always had a way with horses, and within a month the stable's owner was saying Daniel was the best hand he'd had. He slept in the tack room initially, and then rented a small room from a widow on 2nd Street, and he came to Sunday dinner at Ralph and Sadie's house with increasing frequency, and the dinners were loud and argumentative, and full of laughter in the way of families that have earned their easiness. The baby came in October, on a day when the first hard frost had come overnight and the plains were gray and silver, and the sky was the deep, specific blue of a high-pressure autumn morning. It was a boy, which made Ralph sit very still for a moment when the doctor told him, as though the reality of it required more than ordinary processing, and then he went into the room where Sadie was holding the baby and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with a quality of attention that was the same quality he gave to everything important, total and memorizing and completely without pretense. "What do we call him?" Sadie said. They had discussed names during the summer. They had a list. She waited to hear which of the list he would choose now that the list had become a necessary decision. "Thomas," Ralph said, "if you agree." It was the name of Ralph's father, who had been a farmer in Missouri and then a hard-luck man, and then, apparently, a good father by the account Ralph gave of him, which was not effusive but was genuine. Sadie had met the elder Conroy once in the spring, when he had made the trip from Missouri to see his son's new life and new wife, and had liked him immediately because he had the same quality of direct honesty that made Ralph both frustrating and irreplaceable. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Joseph Conroy, named for his grandfather and for Sadie's father, who had been a good man eroded by hard luck, which was a description that covered rather a lot of the good men of that generation and did not define them at their best. The baby was healthy and loud and had Ralph's gray eyes and Sadie's auburn hair, and he regarded the world from the beginning with an alert, evaluating expression that made his parents laugh and Mrs. Plum, who came to visit with a blanket she had been crocheting since Sadie's announcement in the spring, pronounce him the most serious infant she had ever seen. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold and domestic and deeply, quietly happy. The house on the east edge of town was small for 3 people, but arranged itself to accommodate them through the same combination of practicality and goodwill that governed most things in their household. Daniel came for Christmas and stayed through New Year's and proved himself a natural uncle, patient and playful and clearly delighted by Thomas, in a way that seemed to be doing something good for him, giving him a piece of family future to be responsible toward. Ralph's work continued to be the steady imposition of a reliable order on a town that was, inch by inch, becoming more settled and more certain of its own permanence. He handled disputes and investigated thefts, and managed the occasional outbreak of the kind of trouble that cattle money and alcohol produced in trail towns. And he did all of it with the same fundamental fairness that Sadie had identified in him, when she was still trying to decide whether he was a problem or a resource, which now seemed like a distinction from another life. One evening in February 1880, when Thomas was 4 months old and asleep in the room upstairs and the parlor fire was burning well and Sadie had set aside the letter she was writing to tell Ralph about an interesting conversation she'd had that day, Ralph said, without preface, "I've been offered the position of federal marshal for this district." She looked at him. "It would mean a larger territory," he said, "more responsibility, better resources, a deputy assigned from Washington. More complicated cases. Is it what you want?" she asked. He considered the question with the thoroughness she had come to recognize as him taking a question seriously rather than performing consideration. "I think it's what I can do," he said finally. "And doing it well matters because this part of the country needs the kind of law that remembers why it exists." "That's not an answer to whether it's what you want," she said. "No," he agreed. "What I want is what I have, this house, you, Thomas, the sense that the work I'm doing is genuinely useful." He paused. "The federal appointment would let me do more of that work in a bigger way, but it would also take me away from home more often." "I see," she said. "I wouldn't accept it without talking to you first," he said. "Your life changes significantly with it as well." She thought about this carefully, because it deserved to be thought about carefully. She thought about what it meant to be the wife of a federal marshal in 1880 Kansas, the longer absences, the larger dangers, the broader reach of the territory he would be responsible for. She thought about what it meant to be in a house alone with a young baby more often than not, and whether she was equal to that, and determined that she was, because she had never been someone who needed another person present to manage her own life. She also thought about what it meant to be the partner of a man who had told her, on a Christmas night in the middle of the street, that he was trying to make a place where people could live without the kind of fear that made them into worse versions of themselves, and who had been working toward that goal with steady conviction since before she arrived, and who was being offered the means to extend that work. "Accept it," she said. He looked at her. "You would be wasted in a smaller territory," she said. "And I am not a woman who is well served by a man who has more capacity than his position requires. It makes you irritable." The corner of his mouth moved in the way she now understood meant he was actively suppressing a full smile. "Does it?" "Marginally," she said. "Accept the appointment, Ralph. I will manage the home and the business and your brother-in-law and your son, and when you're away I'll write you long letters full of details, and when you come home I'll have something interesting ready to argue about." He crossed the parlor and sat down beside her on the settee, which was something he did in the evenings now with an unself-conscious ease that had taken months to develop, and which she loved unreasonably. He picked up her hand and held it with the same deliberateness he had brought to putting a ring on her finger in the cold Christmas street, as though hands were things that warranted careful holding. "There is no one like you," he said. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "There isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "You know I'm not good at saying the large things," he said. "I know I keep the most important things close and come at them indirectly." "I know," she said. "I find it endearing, occasionally maddening." "Mostly endearing. I want to say it plainly for once," he said, without coming at it indirectly. She waited. "I love you," he said, with the same quality of total honesty he brought to everything he actually committed to, no performance, no ornamentation, just the plain statement of a true thing. "I loved you before I said it was possible. I loved you when I was pretending to notice you only as a professional matter, and I remembered everything you said because I loved you, not because you were a useful source of information, though you were also that." "That is a remarkably honest declaration," she said. "I thought you deserved one," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, the February prairie wind moved against the house with a long, low sound that was the sound of Kansas winter, and inside the fire burned and the house was warm, and somewhere upstairs Thomas was sleeping with his serious gray eyes closed and his small fists uncurled. "I loved you when I came to your office to tell you the truth about Daniel and realized you already knew," she said. "Not immediately, but the process started then. The man who let me tell him anyway, who listened even though he didn't need to, who had been listening all along because the listening mattered to him rather than just the information. That was when I understood what kind of man you were. And that was when you decided to love me. That was when I discovered I had already started," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, briefly and warmly, and she felt it settle through her like the most reliable thing she had ever known. Ralph accepted the federal appointment in March 1880. The ceremony was conducted in the courthouse in Wellington with appropriate formality, and Sadie attended with Thomas on her arm, and Daniel standing at her left shoulder, looking like a young man who had decided what he intended to become, and was in the process of becoming it. The work of a federal marshal in that district was, as anticipated, considerably more demanding and wide-ranging than the work of a town marshal. Ralph was responsible for a territory that stretched across several counties, and the cases that came under federal jurisdiction were frequently more complicated and more dangerous than the local disputes and trail-end troubles of Caldwell's day-to-day. He was away from home more than he had been, sometimes for a week at a stretch, occasionally longer. Sadie had not exaggerated when she told him she would manage. The dressmaking business had grown to occupy a proper room in the house and a second assistant in addition to June, and she had a particular talent for the organizational and financial aspects of running a small business that she had not fully recognized in herself until she was given the opportunity to apply it. She also had a talent, which she had always known about, for getting people to talk to her honestly, which turned out to be as useful in commerce as it was in every other aspect of life. Thomas grew with the rapid intensity of first year, and the letters she wrote to Ralph when he was away were full of Thomas: the first smile, the first reach, the first tooth, the first precarious attempts at the physical project of locomotion, which Thomas undertook at 9 months with the same serious, evaluating expression he had worn since birth, as though walking were a problem that required methodical solution. Daniel had moved from the livery stable to a partnership in a small cattle trading enterprise with a man named Wilson who had recently come to Caldwell from Texas. He had a gift for it, for reading animals and men with equal accuracy, and the enterprise was doing well by the spring of 1880. He was building something real, and watching him build it was one of the most profound satisfactions Sadie had encountered in a life that had not been short of satisfactions. The autumn of 1880 brought a significant case that occupied Ralph for nearly 3 weeks and took him across 2 counties and into a confrontation with a man named Burrow, who had been running a land fraud scheme that had cost dozens of settler families their claims. Sadie read the bulletins from Wellington and Wichita with the careful attention she brought to news that concerned her husband, and when he came home from that case, she met him at the door and looked at him. This man she had married, with his coat dusty from the road and his face tired and more deeply satisfied than tired, and she thought that here was a person who was doing exactly what they were made for, and that being the person who came home to was a meaningful thing to be. The families get their claims back. She asked. "The ones we could document, yes," he said. "It'll take the courts some time to process, but the evidence is solid." "Good," she said. He stepped inside and she closed the door behind him, and Thomas came toddling across the kitchen floor with the lurching, unstoppable momentum of a 13-month-old who had recently mastered walking and was applying it to every situation with maximum enthusiasm. And Ralph picked up his son with a tenderness that had nothing to do with being tired and everything to do with having a reason to come home. The years accumulated with the particular texture of a life that is actively, intentionally lived. By 1882, Thomas had a brother named William, who arrived in the spring with Ralph's serious expression and Sadie's voice, which turned out to be very loud for someone so small. Daniel had married a woman named Helen by then, a schoolteacher from Indiana who had come to Caldwell to teach, and who had the combination of intellectual precision and warmth that drew Daniel out of his remaining defensiveness and gave him something to be fully responsible for. They had a daughter, Ruth, who was born 6 months after William, and who Thomas regarded with the proprietary benevolence of a 3-year-old cousin who considers himself the most competent person in any room. Ralph had, by 1882, built a reputation across the district that was founded on the same principles he had brought to the marshal's office in Caldwell in 1878, a rigorous fairness that did not bend toward convenience, a memory for detail that made his cases well documented and his testimony unimpeachable, and a specific commitment to distinguishing between the dangerous and the lost in a territory where that distinction could mean the difference between a man's life and his death. There were cases that were hard and cases that went wrong, and nights when Sadie heard him working through something at the kitchen table long after she had gone to bed, the scratch of his pen, and the particular silence of a man reviewing something painful. She would come down on those nights with 2 cups of coffee and sit across from him without asking, and sometimes he would tell her what was difficult, and sometimes he would simply work through it in her presence, and either way the being present mattered. He told her once during one of these late nights that he had thought about his life the way he had been living it, and that what he had discovered was that the thing he had been most afraid of before Sadie, before Thomas, before the full reality of the life he had built, was not the physical danger of the work or the moral complexity of it, but the particular loneliness of a person who notices everything and has no one to notice things with. "You were lonely," she said. "I had been lonely so long I'd stopped recognizing it as a condition rather than a fact," he said. "I thought it was simply the shape of my life." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the sounds of their sleeping children upstairs and the prairie wind outside and the particular stillness of a house that is full of people who trust each other. "Now it's not," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the way you reach for something you know is always going to be there, with the confidence of a person who has learned to trust a particular kind of anchor. The decade turned. The 1880s moved through Caldwell the way decades move through frontier towns that are becoming something more than frontier towns, slowly and then rapidly, with the particular irreversibility of a place that has decided what it intends to be. The railroad had come to the region, bringing with it a different kind of change from the cattle trail money, more settled, more permanent, more complicated. There were new families from the east, new businesses, new ambitions. Ralph's work evolved with the territory's evolution. The wild, dangerous quality of the earliest cattle trail years gave way to a different set of challenges as the country filled in, and the old kind of lawlessness was replaced by newer, subtler forms. He adapted, because he was a man who looked directly at what was in front of him rather than what he expected to be in front of him, and adaptation was something he was good at. In 1884, Thomas was 5 and William was 2, and Sadie was expecting again. This pregnancy was different from the first 2 in the specific, hard-to-articulate way that third pregnancies sometimes are, more settled, as though her body understood the process and moved through it without the anxious attention of novelty. She was 32 now, the same age Ralph had been when he married her, and she thought sometimes about that woman on the stage from Wichita in October of 1878, with her 2 valises and her secrets and her very incomplete plan, and felt a profound affection for that woman and everything she had been carrying. The third child was a girl, born in December of 1884, and they named her Clara after the friend who had stood up for Sadie at her wedding. Clara Conroy arrived with auburn hair and gray eyes, which was the combination that seemed to be the family's settled aesthetic, and she regarded her brothers with an equanimity that suggested she understood exactly what she was in for. Daniel had 2 children by then, Ruth and a boy named Joseph after both their fathers, and the extended family filled Sunday dinners with noise and argument, and the particular joyful chaos of people who have found each other and intend to keep on doing so. In 1886, Ralph was approached about a territorial judge position, a step up from the marshal's work into the judicial branch that would have meant a different kind of influence on the shape of justice in the territory. He brought it home and put it in front of Sadie without preface, in the kitchen, the way he brought things he needed to think through, and they talked about it for 3 hours across 2 evenings. He declined. He told her the reason plainly, that a judge worked from a distance, evaluating things that other people brought to him, and that the work he had spent 8 years doing, which was being directly present in the territory, knowing the ground and the people and the specific texture of the country's injustices and possibilities, was the work that fit him best and that he was most effective doing. He could do more good, he believed, where he was. She agreed with him and told him so, and felt the satisfaction of a woman who has spent years married to someone and still finds regularly that his reasoning confirms her early judgment of his character. The 1880s gave way to the 1890s, with the weight and texture of a frontier becoming something less frontier and more simply America, which was complicated in ways that demanded an ongoing reckoning. The land that surrounded Caldwell had been homesteaded and fenced and plowed, and was in the process of becoming the fully agricultural landscape that the Great Plains would be for the next century. The cattle drives that had defined the region of Sadie's arrival were largely memory now, replaced by settled farming and the economies of a different era. Ralph and Sadie's house on the east edge of town had been expanded twice since 1879, a kitchen addition in 1882 and a full upstairs addition in 1886 that gave the children proper rooms of their own and gave the adults the specific luxury of privacy that parents of young children regard with something approaching reverence. The house had the look and feel of a place that has been thoroughly lived in by people who took it seriously, and it was the most permanent thing, Sadie thought sometimes, that she had ever participated in building. Thomas, in 1890, was 11 years old and unmistakably his father's son in the way he moved through the world, with that quality of total attention and careful assessment that had made Ralph both difficult and magnificent. He had his mother's directness and her gift for making people trust her, which was, Ralph said, a combination that would either make him a very fine man or a highly successful confidence trickster, and Sadie said she intended to guide him toward the former, and that the latter was more Ralph's side of the family than hers, which made Ralph laugh in the full, uncontrolled way he had developed over the years of their marriage. The laugh that she had discovered she had always been working toward from the first moment she stood in his doorway. William was 8 and physically unlike both his parents, brown-haired and quick and in perpetual motion, interested in everything with a restlessness that was not anxiety but pure appetite for experience. He had started following Daniel to the cattle trading enterprise on Saturdays and had the easy, natural way with animals that Daniel had, which Sadie took as evidence of the kind of inheritance that skips the obvious path and arrives somewhere unexpected. Clara was 6 and already demonstrating with cheerful clarity that she had no intention of occupying any space that was smaller than her actual dimensions, social, intellectual, or literal. She had Ralph's gray eyes and used them with a precision that Sadie recognized as something she had passed on, and that occasionally made her feel simultaneously proud and deeply concerned. The summer of 1891 was the summer that Sadie, reviewing the accounts of the dressmaking business, which had become a proper establishment with 3 full-time employees, and a reputation that drew customers from Wellington and even occasionally from Wichita, realized that what had started as a survival measure had become something she had built with intentional craft over 13 years, and that it was genuinely impressive, and that she was genuinely proud of it. Not the way you are proud of something you have struggled with, but the way you are proud of something you have loved, because she had loved the work, the problem-solving of it. The way a well-made garment expressed something real about the person wearing it. She told Ralph this one evening, and he listened with the quality of attention that had never once in 13 years diminished, and said, "I know," which was both insufficient and exactly right, because what he meant was that he had always known, that he had been watching her build it the way he watched everything important to him, thoroughly, and with appreciation that expressed itself in steadiness rather than performance. Ralph retired from the federal marshal's position in 1895, at 50, not because the work was beyond him, but because the territory had changed enough that the work was changing into something that required different skills, and because the children were growing up in ways that demanded more of his presence than the road allowed, and because he had spent 17 years being someone who went away and came home, and he had decided it was time to be someone who stayed. He took a position as a justice of the peace for the county, which was in some ways a smaller stage and in other ways exactly the right size, because it gave him the direct engagement with the specific, individual cases of justice and injustice that he had always found more meaningful than policy from a distance. He was good at it for the same reasons he had been good at everything, because he listened, because he remembered, because he brought the full weight of his attention to bear on what was actually in front of him. The children grew. Thomas went to read law in Topeka, and came back to the county as a young attorney with his father's reputation for fairness preceding him, and his mother's talent for making people comfortable enough to tell him the truth serving him better than most legal techniques. William went into business with Daniel and was making a considerable success of it by his mid-20s, the cattle trade having evolved but not disappeared, and Daniel's enterprise having grown into one of the more significant in the county. Clara went east to study at a women's college in the 1890s, which Sadie supported with the full weight of her conviction, and Ralph supported with the quiet, thorough approval of a man who believed his daughter deserved every opportunity his sons had. Daniel and Helen had added another child to their family by the end of the decade, a second son named Ralph, which Daniel proposed with a diffidence that Sadie recognized as her brother being moved by something he didn't know how to express directly, and which Ralph accepted with a quietness that told her he was moved in the same proportion. The years moved through their house on the east edge of Caldwell, with the gradual accumulation of a life that has been built by people who understood what they were building. The edges of the furniture softened. The children's marks on the doorframe where Ralph had measured their heights every birthday climbed upward, and then stopped climbing when the children were too tall or too old for the ceremony, though Clara had demanded hers be continued into college as a tradition, which Ralph had honored without being asked twice. On a September evening in 1897, Ralph and Sadie sat on the porch of the house on the east edge of town and watched the last of a spectacular sunset burn down over the Kansas plains, the kind of sunset that the flat landscape is designed for, the full width of the sky available for the color to spread itself across, amber and rose and a deep, extraordinary blue that held the light longer than seemed possible. Thomas was 28. Practicing law in Wellington, and recently engaged to a woman named Anna who Sadie had approved with full conviction after a single dinner. William was 25, and his partnership with Daniel's son Joseph was already producing results that exceeded the enterprise's previous years. Clara was 22, and in the middle of a correspondence with a young professor of natural history from Kansas State College in Manhattan that was technically academic and clearly personal, and Sadie was watching it develop with the interested attention of a woman who recognized the signs. Daniel and Helen were coming to dinner on Sunday, along with all the small Doyles and Conroys who were still in the county, which was most of them. The sunset did what all good sunsets do and gave everything it had, and then let the darkness come, quietly and without ceremony, and the first stars appeared over the prairie with the absolute clarity of a Kansas night sky in September. "Tell me something you've never said," Sadie said. It was a question she asked him sometimes, because the years had not entirely removed his habit of managing difficult feelings at arm's length rather than speaking them directly, and she found that invitations worked better than demands. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think about that first month sometimes. The investigation. When I knew who you were and let you talk because I wanted to hear what you would say." "Yes," she said. "I've always felt some guilt about that," he said. "The position it put you in, letting you think you were managing a situation when I had the advantage over you." "I know you have," she said. "I've known for a long time." He looked at her. "You've been careful with me in ways that go back to that," she said. "The extra consideration, the specific honesty. The apologies when they're warranted, which you don't give easily. I understand what those are for." "And does it bother you?" he said. "When you think about it now." She considered this genuinely because it deserved a genuine answer. She thought about October 1878, about standing in his doorway with a confession and finding it unnecessary, about the moment she had understood the trap she had walked into with her eyes open. "No," she said, "because whatever the initial condition was, what you did with the things you heard was exactly what I had needed someone to do with them, which was to take them seriously and act on them with fairness. The method was a little underhanded. The outcome was what I asked for." "You are very generous," he said. "I am very accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had held in the cold Christmas street before he put a ring on it, the hand he had held 1,000 times in all the ordinary and extraordinary moments since, and held it with the same quality of careful deliberateness he had always brought to the things he considered important. The prairie night spread out around the house on the east edge of Caldwell, wide and dark and absolutely itself, the stars enormous overhead and the grass moving in a light wind, and somewhere south of the river, far away now in time and implication, the country that had made the worst and best of their story. "I love you," he said, as directly and without ornamentation as he always said the things he most meant. "I know," she said. "You've been telling me without saying it since the first time I walked into your office. You just eventually found the words." "Eventually," he agreed. She leaned against him on the porch of their house, with their life around them in every direction, and felt the full settled weight of something she had not been looking for when she arrived in Caldwell with her 2 valises and her secrets, and her determination to rescue her brother from his mistakes. She had come looking for Daniel's future and found her own. The night settled around them with the patience of something that had no urgency, because the things worth having, she had learned, were rarely urgent in the end. They were slow and accumulating and built from all the small moments of paying attention, of remembering what mattered, of showing up in someone's doorway and telling the truth piece by piece until the whole truth was finally, fully said. The stars moved overhead in their ancient, impassive progression, and Ralph Conroy held his wife's hand in the autumn dark, and remembered, as he always remembered, everything she had ever said.